An Idol Crumbles. Some reflection on our current unraveling. The gyre widens and the vibe shift continues. That much is certain. The world doesn't feel the same as it did in 2019, and never will again. There's a vague scent of apocalypse in the air. The old political formulas don't make sense, and people are starting to re-examine their old, comfortable assumptions. This being written in early October 2023, the example most readily at hand is the war in Gaza. Being a completely ineffable war emerging out of no classical political logic, I would not in fact be surprised if the event had a more lasting impact on the boundaries of the West's own fraying political coalitions than in the boundaries of the belligerent countries. In fact, this small brush war has squarely divided our late republic, less between the citizens' support for either foreign party than in their appetite for a new protracted political conflict. Americans might be ready for a fight if they could figure out what being American even meant. From rising crime, creeping inflation, a porous border, and a rapidly declining foreign power structure, not much is making sense in the liberal American order. Certainly, this is the case now for many of the more moderate, liberal, progressive types, slowly realizing that the viciously fanatical anti-colonial activists, which they trained for decades in American universities, are indeed playing for keeps, and not willing to stop just when it makes bourgeoisie leftists feel uncomfortable. There is now a new group of people looking at our situation and trying to turn back from the precipice, wondering if there is a way to return to the sanity of previous decades. Even for those ultimately sympathetic to the goals of progressivism, this would be an ideal time to take a step back from the crazier ideas that have become the ruling mainstream for the last several decades. Regardless of what we might think about the ultimate end of leftist ideas, at the moment modern progressivism is creating chaos and threatening the entire system with a cascading collapse of wealth and credibility. There has been a long-standing debate between various members of the dissident sphere, most notably R.N. McIntyre and Academic Agent, on whether the system is capable of strategic ideological moderation, aka, can it put the woke away? However, after everything has been said in this exchange, there is not much of a disagreement. We all know that retraction is impossible. Aside from merely performative measures that convince nobody, no broader permanent cultural moderation can possibly occur. It doesn't matter how tactically useful such a move might be for far-sighted activists, or how stabilizing it would be for institutional power. This machine only goes in one direction. For those interested in reform, the only way out of this mess is through it, and society will have to experience some fully realized crisis, minimally a spiritual one, to recover the wisdom needed to restore sanity. But one might ask, why? Explanations vary. Outside of appeals to the finer points of elite theory, most people have an implicit understanding that all modes of conservatism have failed. But that doesn't mean people aren't going to try their hands at turning back the clock and breathing life into the dying liberal order, even if they understand that many of the issues driving the modern insanity trace their origin back to fundamental modern values, not easily modified. Two such conservative reformist examples, prominent in my own mind, are Richard Hanania and Patrick Deneen. Both clever thinkers in their own right, Hanania and Deneen understand that the root cause of modern progressive failures do not lie in some recent radical perversion of the late 70s or 80s, but rather owe to fundamental flaws built into our legal and cultural systems going back at least to the early civil rights era, if not further back to our country's origins and Enlightenment principles. These propositions are rather uncontroversial for any non-progressive in 2023. Still, it is much harder to come up with a workable solution. Certainly, Hanania and Deneen struggle with this problem themselves, implying throughout their more recent work that our political and cultural crisis might be fixed with just the right set of political readjustments. After all, it wasn't so long ago that America was a sane place, was it? A small change brought us to this ruin. Why could not another small change restore us to glory? For example, if our problem really is a public square devoid of civic or religious virtue, Could this not be undone by reestablishing faith in Republican values? Or alternatively, if the source of our woes is simply the legal legacy of the late civil rights movement, why not simply address the legal issue directly with legislation and lawfare? The problem with these reform-minded solutions originates in a fundamental misunderstanding about the nature of politics itself. For humans, the political concept is less about specific policies or cultural outcroppings, and more about a religious story that drives their relationship with the world. Whether you learn the lesson from Carl Schmitt, Joseph de Maistre, or Lorgar Aurelian, the principle remains the same. The core part of mankind's political instinct is found in narrative, identity, and faith. Any change that does not modify this core will therefore ultimately be transient and doomed to eventual failure. This religious dimension of politics is indeed why wokeness, the full consequences of the 1960s cultural revolution, did not become prominent until the coming of age of the baby boomers' children, the millennials. The old-school radicals of the anti-Vietnam War protests and the free love movement were in many ways more extreme than the activists of today, but their radicalism was an adult affectation built on a religious substructure of a classic American identity. For millennials, however, progressivism was the only serious religion that they ever knew, and they believed it. Likewise, the problem with virtually all mainstream solutions to our cultural crisis is that they don't fully grasp the magnitude of what a true religious conversion would look like. At best, they imagine policy shifts that arrest the progressive drift forward, but leave the fundamental narrative logic of the religious system in place. This means that eventually the spiritual sensibilities of our society will intervene and undo whatever conservative policy proposals were enacted, no matter how sane or prudent. What would a genuine conversion away from progressivism to something distinctly anti-progressive even look like? It's hard to say. Probably no one has a firm understanding of what such a cultural shift would look like, since virtually all religious movements of significance for the last 2 centuries have gone in the opposite direction. It can't be moderate or measured, however much we might want a soft landing, and anyone not getting a sense of vertigo thinking about the proposition is not thinking about the proposition seriously. The particulars of this issue are easier to recognize via example. Here perhaps we can examine the 2 most obvious instances of leftist overreach, often cited as opportunities for rightward reform. First, contemporary urban depolicing, and second, sex reassignment for transgender minors. Both of these policies are manifestly insane. Both policies have resulted in large-scale social harm with many victims, and both policies are inexplicably promoted at all levels by presumably moderate politicians and government officials. For example, on the issue of crime and policing, we have witnessed the most marked acceleration in American urban decay and violent crime in decades. The cause is obviously a refusal to apply increased discretional policing within African American communities or enforce vagrancy laws on homeless drug users. The result is unsafe cities, record crime rates, closed businesses, and unlivable urban communities, with even well-to-do progressives looking for a way to escape the mess they created. Alternatively, on the issue of transgenderism in minors, America has seen an unprecedented spike in adolescents seeking drugs and irreversible body modification, strikingly similar to other social contagions such as anorexia and bulimia in the 1990s. However, not only has the government and medical establishment failed to address this problem, they have poured gasoline on the fire, standing behind questionable and likely false research, pushing for untested medical procedures, and vilifying whistleblowers as dangerous radicals, all to assert a mutability of physical sex that even very young children can see is manifestly false. So, right away, we have 2 slam-dunk issues for the reformist crowd: easily demonstrable problems brought about by bad policies with reformist solutions and broad public support. So what are the chances that these solutions will be implemented and made permanent? Very small. Because any return to sanity that could possibly be imagined, while yielding results, would, in the final state of things, be fundamentally dissonant with the religious narrative of our ruling class. A reformist policy position, willing to hold back the worst of things, might work for a time, but pretty soon the true believers are going to start asking the nagging questions about why so many Africans are being put in prison, and why we are holding back so many starry-eyed young people from pursuing their ultimate sexual calling, achievable only through prepubescent genital surgery. Thus, even as the fire rises, those sitting at the foot of the flames will deny its heat, even as it consumes their bodies. Recently, a spate of killings of progressive activists has thrown the social media space into a buzz. I suppose urban murders are not an altogether uncommon event, given the general decline of public safety. Still, the recent killings involved an uncommon amount of irony. Each victim seems to have walked blindly into danger, with very little awareness of their situation. Furthermore, each of their social media profiles was chock full of anarchist-style activism and support for urban depolicing policies, often even mocking skeptics concerned with the growing danger of crime in their cities. But perhaps more strange than the victims themselves were the responses of their colleagues, often barely pausing for breath, reflection, or remorse for their fallen friends before reposting another reason to support the cause. It would seem that even death itself was little more than a speed bump to the political fervor that organized their lives. Still, watching their reaction from the outside did put me in mind of my own journey away from the progressive worldview, and how the liberal narrative slowly became unraveled in my own psyche. Of the recent tragedies, the one most pertinent to my reflections was the killing of a Philadelphia area progressive activist, Josh Kruger. Kruger, himself a prominent gay activist with a long history of verbally attacking Christians and conservatives, had just come off a long series of online posts attacking moderates and skeptics who felt Philadelphia's urban depolicing policies were leaving the city more dangerous. When Kruger was found murdered in his own Philadelphia home, shortly after mocking Dilbert creator Scott Adams for his concern over crime, the irony was palatable. But in fact, the real story was much stranger yet. As it turned out, the African-American youth who murdered Kruger was in fact an ex-lover who, as per the testimony of his family, had been groomed by Kruger into a sexual affair via drugs and blackmail at a young age. The circumstances were only made more dissonant by the excavation of additional tweets from Kruger complaining about his own history of being the victim of abuse at almost an identical age to the ex-lover who eventually murdered him. What struck me instantly was how starkly this story contrasted with Josh Kruger's online presentation. On the surface, there was the distance between his uber-confident, professional, progressive public face and his double life as a semi-criminal lowlife. But then also, at a more psychological level, there was the contrast between Kruger's professed sexual identity as a victim of sexual abuse and his alleged role as a victimizer. The Kruger affair seemed to expose a myth of the modern progressive religion that I once devoutly believed: the trope of the eternally noble homosexual, or the good gay. Perhaps I am dating myself here, but when I was a progressive in the early 2000s, the image of the good gay was in its prime. Homosexual men were the central religious icon of the left, the symbol both of progressive aspirations and cultural dominance. I was never clear on how this perception entered into my own mind at a very young age, yet it seemed obvious that gay men were just better across the board. More professional, wiser, better at understanding the opposite sex, and better at navigating the complexities of life itself. After all, marriage equality was the most important issue of our time. Gay marriage was not just a matter of fairness, it was a spearhead towards a more scientific, more emancipatory, and more reasonable understanding of sex itself. This was the age of Queer Eye for the Straight Guy, Sex and the City, and Will and Grace, and many real-world gay luminaries who I took very seriously. Among this company, the figures of Andrew Sullivan and Dan Savage figured prominently in my own intellectual development, as each helped me to navigate the rocky terrain of sexuality and religion. But it is surprising in hindsight just how heavily each of these men leaned their intellectual brand on the trope of the good gay. For Andrew Sullivan, there was always the pretense of being the considerate and well-read British queer. Tied to prudence and contemplation, Sullivan seemed content to follow the traditions of his ancestors, as far as a conservative gay man could. Like W.H. Auden and Oscar Wilde before him, Andrew was knowledgeable and fascinated by the mystery and wisdom of the old ways, while at the same time unjustly forced to remain outside of his faith due to the bigotry of religious fundamentalists who didn't understand the true magic of their beliefs. On the more secular side of things, the sex advice columnist Dan Savage became the living symbol of the new expert-driven approach to consent-based relationships. He was the guy who got it, and who could make the increasingly troubled relations between men and women all make sense. He was good, giving, and game. He was open to new experiences, but still in a monogamous relationship with his lifelong partner. Who better, then, to be the visionary for what sex should mean in the 21st century? Yet, as time went on, the more I learned about each of these men, the more the image of the good gay began to disintegrate. Andrew Sullivan, far from the considerate and prudent English gentleman, revealed himself over time to be a supremely small thinker. Prone to petty vindictiveness, emotionally incontinent online outbursts of rage, and strange obsessions with celebrity politicians, the man demonstrated no understanding of the consequences of the reforms he demanded. Like all boomers, Sullivan's worldview relied on the traditional moral assumptions of the West to exist indestructibly for his ideas to make any sense. Once the last remnants of the old world began to fall away in earnest, his commentary shifted from reasonable introspection to wistful and useless platitudes about how things should be. Likewise, with Dan Savage, the illusion of reasonability was short-lived. Savage's presentation of a common-sense post-sexual revolution method for achieving monogamy was anything but what it claimed to be. What started as a more transparent approach to handling adultery later transformed into an excuse for virtually all infidelity, with a podcast host jokingly issuing non-monogamy permission slips to those who called in. Here, again, in Dan Savage, was also the petty political vindictiveness, where the podcast host, often praised for his balanced and fair takes, took great lengths to viciously put down his political enemies, oftentimes employing transparent moral double standards. And these double standards only worsened post-2012 with the reemergence of feminism and the Me Too movement, with Savage endorsing any number of impossibly puritanical consent-based restrictions on heterosexual sex that he had very obviously never practiced in his own personal life. In fact, Dan Savage's emotional instability and on-again, off-again puritanism mapped closely to my own experiences with gay men. Far from the uber-confident good gays I saw on TV, the homosexuals I knew in real life were deeply troubled people, perhaps sympathetic in their own life, but often coping with early life sexual trauma in a highly destructive way. I wouldn't say that the men I've known in these kinds of situations were evil people, but they were struggling, and their lives were, for lack of a better word, more than a little squalid. Yet, for whatever reason, none of this darkness ever manifested publicly. Instead, it was always the same kind of campy effeminacy, the smiling mask over the wounded soul, contradictions covering up a more conflicted existence, and preaching about a high standard of health and morality that was, from what I could tell, completely absent in their own lives. It's exactly this quality that I now see again in the story of Josh Kruger. What to make of this poor soul participating in the abuse of another man while bemoaning his own status as a victim? I'm sure that there is some sympathetic way of reading his story, but sympathetic or not, harm victim or devious villain, fraud or understandable loser, what marks Kruger's story is just how poorly it fits into the classic Hollywood image of the good gay, and just how well his story fits into the pre-20th century understanding of sexual deviancy. Under the ancient conception of homosexuality, men's lust for other men was viewed less as an equal and opposite force to men's attraction to women, and more as something exogenous to healthy human behavior itself. Homosexuality was an extension of uncontrolled male sexual energy, more akin to what we would call a paraphilia or a kink. As such, the practice was something to be contained and kept private, to the extent that it was considered licit at all. There was an understanding that if this kind of activity was allowed to go on publicly, and in an unconstrained manner, it would inevitably invite other pathologies, which would in turn erode and destroy the social fabric itself. But political and cultural bias aside, might we ask if the ancient conception of homosexuality was more aligned with reality than our own modern view? To ask the question in 2023 is to answer it. Not only have all the slippery slope predictions of the old religious right been vindicated, the only way we can even pretend that the new order is working is by reframing our social values in a way that would look transparently insane to any person born before 1960. Okay, man, maybe it's not a problem that people aren't having children anymore, or that our social system will collapse imminently, or that our culture will die with us. I mean, how does any of that affect you personally? Yeah, sure. That notion might sell to nihilistic millennials, but not so much to any other human who has ever existed. It's strange when you think about how historic attitudes to sexuality are framed by the left, as if our society is uniquely homophobic. Yet if any scion from one of these more open civilizations, such as Greece or Japan, were shown the modern LGBTQ movement, they would recommend the greatest amount of punitive violence imaginable, even if they themselves had engaged in some recreational buggery on the side. There is no rational way to justify modernity's attitudes towards deviant lifestyles. And yet, despite it all, I can never really emotionally internalize the reality of the old perspective. No matter how many of the seedy realities I observe, the fictional image of the good gay from Will and Grace and Sex and the City is always the rule. The Josh Krugers and Dan Savages of the world are always the exceptions. And so, I proceed within the mode of the practical blue pill, ignoring the underlying social problems at an emotional level, just to carry on. I suppose I might justify this attitude as a kind of charity. It's always good to assume the best of people, but maybe this is my own weakness as a modern person. A functionally progressive perspective is necessary for living in modern America. I have to work in a liberal environment, and while I understand so-called red-pilled realities, living inside them emotionally from day to day would be exhausting and unsustainable. What would it mean for our perspectives on these issues to fundamentally change at a deep religious level? How would it feel to wake up in a world where everyone saw clearly the insanity of the modern system, as their ancestors certainly would have? What would be the implications of a leadership class and a popular front willing to make the necessary corrections? Nothing friendly, nothing comfortable, maybe nothing humane. Because once the old gods of religious passion have stirred from their slumber, there is really no putting them back in the bottle. That's the problem with belief. Whether we like the results or not, true faith binds us to obligations and harsh realities we rather wouldn't face, and things we rather wouldn't do. I'm reminded here of the Divine Comedy. As Virgil and Dante descend to the deeper circles of the Inferno, a transformation takes place in the disposition of the poet. At first, Dante is distraught at witnessing the damned souls suffering for eternity for the finite crimes of their temporal lives. How could this be a truly deserved end? Do not the condemned deserve pity, even if they are condemned by perfect justice itself? But by the time Dante and Virgil arrive at the lower levels of Malbolgia, hearing the stories of the crimes of the condemned as they go, a change in attitude occurs, and Dante begins greeting each new sinner with indignation. He now understands that the sinners imprisoned there built their own prison and have destroyed their own souls in the process. What is being condemned and punished is nothing more than the sin itself. Could justice require anything else? I should clarify my own position. I do not believe that the suffering of the damned glorifies the hosts of heaven, and if hell is indeed eternal, I do not believe its agonies weigh on the minds of the saints, for better or for worse. Still, Dante is pointing at an eternal truth. Just as fear of God is the beginning of wisdom, hatred of evil is the beginning of moral vitality. And if the defect of our own age is characterized by anything, it is a lack of such moral vitality. I recognize this defect in myself more than in others, but weakness is weakness and must be exposed. Our age is tired and effeminate. We can't look at the past without chortling vanity. We can't look at the future without craven delusion. We can't make eye contact with man himself without reducing him to manageable quantities. And we can't even acknowledge the existence of genuine evil. But if there's one thing we might take from the ancient understanding of spirituality, it is just that iniquity, whether acknowledged or not, summons its own destruction. The wages of sin are death, and once a crime against nature has been committed, the Furies will seek vengeance upon the perpetrator, whether or not he believes in their existence. Our ancestors, both pagan and Christian, understood this reality. We pretend to forget because all of us know deep in our souls that our own civilization is guilty of the one unforgivable defect that the fates never fail to punish: spiritual weakness. And so justice will come to our degenerated society, just as it does to the degenerated criminal, the deluge carrying away everything that cannot stand upright, the rain falling on the just and the unjust alike. I suppose this is where we return to our own year of 2023, in a civilization racked by crisis after crisis of its own making. People are sleepwalking through these times because no one wants to wake up and take note of the situation, for fear of what that reality might imply or ask of them. We all know the bitter winds of prophecy that now blow in the air. We know that the idols of the old order are hollow and waiting to crumble, but we still seek shelter in their shadows, even as we curse their falseness. Will things ever change? They have to. Truth cannot be denied, and eventually the old vengeful gods will return, perhaps in the form of a new, terrible, but heroic figure? A king? A prophet? Some combination of the two? You hear a lot of speculation like this in the distant sphere, but often I feel there's a fundamental misunderstanding about what our age requires to bring about change. People say they want truth and justice, but we already can see truth and justice in the modern world. We see truth every time we walk outside and open our eyes, and we see justice in every one of our nightmares. Instead, what our age critically lacks is a way to process these realities in a way that is not collectively suicidal, a way to reawaken the emotion of healthy human spirituality without unleashing our death drive. Perhaps it's wishful thinking to think that this process can be accomplished peacefully. Religious awakenings are typically very violent affairs. However, I think critics misunderstand the role that a monarchical leader will play in this process of civilizational transformation. The sovereign is not concerned with creating violence, but restraining the violence that is already coming, directing it towards educational ends and towards the purpose of revitalization. He is less a sword of a new justice and more a shield that prevents natural consequence from obliterating everything from the old order. Thus, as always, the mark of any true prophet, the mark of any true king, is not anger, but mercy. The ability to mold weakness into strength, and to give the new generation another chance. Will this prophet be able to wield the power needed to root out our sinfulness, rediscover passions, and build an ark to ride the blood-dimmed tides now loosed upon the world? If so, it will require reconciliation only reachable with divine mercy, and a new leader might direct humanity back to that providence. Or at least I pray he will, because mercy is what we all need if there is to be hope for any of us.